Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here today. We are here in the third webinar of the Super-G Stakeholders Webinar Series 2021. This is a webinar dedicated to the policies now and tomorrow. Here you have a program. So we will have Alan Matthews first, speaking about the trajectory for EU and national policies around permanent grasslands. Then we will pass the word to Martina Spoerri from Agroscope. She will speak about the drivers of grassland use intensity and agricultural policies in Switzerland. And at the end, we will have Eva Lieberherr from ETH-Zurich, speaking about the effectiveness of policies promoting sustainable permanent grassland, mapping, understanding, and key stakeholder perceptions. I will give the floor to Alan Matthews. Alan is the Professor Emeritus of European Agricultural Policy at the Trinity College, Dublin in Ireland. He is a former president of the European Association of Agricultural Economists and has been a member of Ireland's Climate Change Advisory Council. And he's also a member of the External Advisory Board of the Super-G project. He's a regular contributor to the blog CapReform.eu on issues related with the EU's Common Agricultural Policy. Alan, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I just take the opportunity to share my screen. And I'm very pleased to be with you this afternoon. I think all of you will be aware that last Friday, the Council and European Parliament reached a political agreement on the future CAP. And I thought that the most useful thing that I could do would be to try to highlight some of the implications of that agreement, as I see it, for permanent grassland policy in the European Union. But that comes with some risks, and I make these caveats that we don't have the final legal texts as yet. So what I am going to say is based on the summaries of the agreement that we have and some insights into the trilogue documents. As you know, a key objective of this CAP reform is to raise the environmental and climate ambition of the CAP. And that is reflected in a so-called new green architecture, which I illustrate here. As you know, the CAP has the two pillars. So the second pillar, so-called rural development policy. Here we have the agri-environment climate measures, which are very familiar to farmers throughout the Union. And the new agreement will ring fence a slightly larger share of the Pillar 2 budget for these measures. But the big changes are in the Pillar 1, which is where, of course, the direct payments are funded. And direct payments, farmers to be eligible for these have to meet certain mandatory requirements. In the current CAP, these are set out in the so-called cross-compliance standards, but also the standards required to be eligible for the greening payment. And in the new CAP, those two sets of standards will be combined into what the Commission has called enhanced conditionality. So these will be mandatory standards for all farmers who receive CAP payments. But then the Pillar 1 funding itself will be divided into a series of slices, if you like. The basic payment will be the major one. There will also be additional payments for small farmers, for coupled payments, for young farmers, and so on. But the key innovation from the environment and climate point of view is the introduction of what are called eco-schemes. And these will make up at least 25% of the Pillar 1 envelope. And another innovation is that unlike the agri-environment climate schemes, there will be greater flexibility around the way member states actually compensate farmers for the practices that they will enroll for. So let's start with the definitions. These are always a key element of EU legislation. And the 2013 reform introduced a major change in the definition of permanent grassland. It changed the term actually from permanent pasture in order to include in this land use species such as shrubs and trees used for grazing. It's a complicated definition, but what I want to highlight is I think probably relatively small changes that seem to have been agreed for the next CAP. And I've highlighted the two here. So it's permanent grassland is defined not only as grassland that hasn't been included in a crop rotation for 5 years or more, but also I've highlighted it here in bold, where member states so decide, grassland that has not been ploughed up or not tilled or not reseeded for 5 years or more. So slightly, it gives, if you like, it seems an additional possibility to include some areas that perhaps were not included in the current definition. And indeed also, where member states so decide, grassland can include other species such as shrubs or trees which produce animal feed. So not just be grazed, but also produce animal feed. To be honest, as an economist, I'm not sure of the significance of these changes. It would be great if somebody in the Q&A later was able to say why these changes might have been made and who was looking for them. One of the key obligations under the current CAP, the greening requirement for permanent grassland, is that member states are required to maintain the area of permanent grassland based on a ratio with the total agricultural area. And here, the new agreement appears to give further options to member states. So in other words, it's not only that the permanent grassland ratio should be maintained at a member state or a national level, but options appear to be given that this could be also a requirement, not only at regional or sub-regional or even group of holding or even at holding level. The Commission in the 2013 reform had already attempted to suggest that the requirement should apply also at the holding level, but that was rejected at the time. But it now appears to have been introduced, as I read this, as a sort of voluntary option which member states may avail of. The reference year has been changed from 2015 to 2018, but again, the requirement will be that you cannot have a larger than a 5% reduction compared to that reference year. And presumably how that will actually be operated in practice will be spelled out in subsequent Commission guidance. Important to note that there's no additional mandatory obligations, in other words, in this enhanced conditionality on the management of permanent grassland. But of course, such measures could be funded, as we'll see, under the new eco schemes or under agri-environment climate measures. Another important requirement under the greening payment was protection of so-called environmentally sensitive permanent grasslands. And there were two areas defined under that heading. One was where member states were obliged to define areas of environmentally sensitive permanent grassland within Natura 2000 areas. And they could also, if they wished to, they could define such areas outside Natura 2000 areas. And the obligation there was a ban on ploughing and converting these environmentally sensitive areas. And I suppose the significance of this is that these rules offered, if you like, parcel level protection of permanent grassland against conversion, as opposed to the, if you like, the member state requirement, which still would have allowed, specific areas of grassland to be converted, provided that the overall obligation was met at the member state level. These particular rules on environmentally sensitive permanent grassland have now been replaced by a new so-called GAEC standard. So GAEC is these standards of good agricultural and environmental condition practice, which are included in the enhanced conditionality. Here, the Commission proposal was that there should be a ban on converting or ploughing permanent grassland in Natura 2000. In other words, all permanent grassland. It wouldn't be any longer up to member states to define what these areas should be, but actually the political agreement has reintroduced that. So there will be a ban on converting or ploughing permanent grassland designated as environmentally sensitive permanent grasslands within Natura 2000 sites. And there had been a concern that the previous rules favored, if you like, biodiversity, but not necessarily another important role for permanent grasslands, the maintenance of carbon stocks, because actually 96% of these environmentally sensitive areas were defined in Natura 2000 areas. So here, a new GAEC, the so-called GAEC 2, is of relevance. Because this requires appropriate protection of wetlands and peatlands. Now, I'm not sure of the final wording here. There were suggestions that appropriate would be replaced by effective or by minimum. In the final agreement, there is a derogation, if you like. Member states have, if they wish, a couple of years before they implement this GAEC standard, because some member states said they didn't have appropriate maps and there would be some technical work to be done. And there was also a concern that land covered by this GAEC, in other words, these wetlands and peatlands, should not lose their agricultural status. So member states are obliged, when establishing this standard, to ensure that on the land concerned, an agricultural activity suitable for qualifying the land as agricultural area may be maintained. And presumably we'll get further guidance on what all of that will mean from the Commission in due course. Finally, then, we have these new eco-schemes, which are intended to help the EU to meet its Green Deal targets under both the farm to fork and biodiversity strategies. I'm not going to go through these targets. I think they're probably well known to people on this call. But just to give some examples that are relevant to permanent grassland, which could be funded under eco-schemes, and of course also under the Pillar 2 environmental schemes as well. So these are taken from a Commission list, fact sheet, and you can see that there's actually quite a range of potential schemes of interest which would enhance the quality of management of permanent grassland. And including at the bottom there, the re-wetting of organic soils. And that brings me to my final point, which is just to highlight, as not part of this CAP reform as such, but it is flagged in the farm to fork strategy, where the Commission intends to bring forward a proposal to encourage what they call carbon farming. Basically, they see it as a new business model for farmers, where farmers could indeed get paid for sequestering carbon in the soil. And indeed, this will be accompanied later on by some new regulatory framework which would certify these carbon removals and establish a robust accounting system. And potentially, of course, this could also be of interest to permanent grassland in the future. My concluding remark is simply to point out that this CAP legislation sets the framework for agricultural policy, but as part of the new governance arrangements, it'll be up to the member states to define their level of ambition, because they have to define national CAP strategic plans. So to translate the objectives into national policies. These are due to be submitted to the Commission for approval by the end of this year. So, it will be interesting to observe, and indeed there's still the possibility to try to shape and influence those national plans, to try to ensure that they are of greatest relevance to the safeguarding and protection of permanent grassland in the Union in the future. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to any questions or comments that may come later in the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan, to be right on time. So it was awesome, and what a great presentation. I think that probably people will have questions. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the 3 presentations. So please use the Q&A chat to put your questions to Alan, to Martina, and to Eva. So now we are going to pass on to Martina Spoerri. She holds a master's degree in agricultural science from ETH-Zurich with a focus on food and resource economics. Since November 2018, she is an external PhD student in the agricultural economics and policy group at ETH-Zurich, while working at the socioeconomic groups at Agroscope. Her PhD project will focus on driving forces behind intensive grassland use. So please, Martina, the floor is yours.
So thank you. I welcome you all to my presentation. As mentioned, I look in my PhD, I look at driving forces behind grassland use intensity. And yes, and part of the project is related to Super-G, to the work package 4.2, where we have been doing interviews with farmers, 75 interviews in 5 different countries, about drivers and barriers of more environmentally friendly production and more sustainable production in grasslands. And I will today show some first results of these interviews, but I will also give you a short overview on grassland use intensity in Switzerland as an introduction and mention another side project that I have. And this first part that I will present as an introduction is actually also my first paper, and it serves like motivation for the rest of it. But first of all, why do I look at grassland use intensity instead of single ecosystem services or policies? Well, grassland use intensity is connected to other ecosystem services. So if you have high grassland use intensity for the farmer, this means that you have increased output and increased output quality, of course, but it stands in competition with other ecosystem services, and it poses a threat to local habitat. So when I look at grassland use intensity, I can look at the whole package at the same time. And also, which is important for me, it's very easily measurable in Switzerland, because grassland use is always directly connected to animal husbandry within the farm. So I can just look at the stocking rate. So livestock units, I look at ruminant livestock units per hectare, and then I have an indicator, very good indicator for a grassland use intensity. And one thing that is also important, as you see in the left corner now, we have this farm structural survey. We have a survey of all the farms in Switzerland, and I have around 50,000 observations of farms that are producing on grassland. So these are farms that have at least 1 hectare of grassland and at least 1 ruminant livestock unit on their farm. And I have these observations for 19 years, so I can actually look how they have evolved in the last couple of years, whether they intensified or de-intensified. And one thing that is also very important for me is this data is spatially explicit, so I have coordinates of every single farm. So when we look, I can calculate the stocking rate for every single farm. And when we look at these variables that are important for me, for example, livestock unit per farm or grassland area per farm, and see how these farms have distributed over the last 19 years, you see here with box plots, and the red lines show the 5% and the 95% percentile. You see that, of course, livestock units per farm and grassland area per farm increased. This just the structural change that is happening in Switzerland, but you also see this gap that is actually opening. So the heterogeneity among farms is increasing. And what does it look like for the stocking rate now, the actual land use intensity? And there we see that there is actually a slight decrease in intensity. So farmers on average extensify their production, but here also we see this gap opening. And one of my first questions I asked myself is there a spatial dimension to this heterogeneity, to this increase of heterogeneity? Are there any clusters of, for example, intensive production? Because clusters of intensive production are always very threatening to local habitats and local ecosystems. And as I mentioned, I do have spatial information of every farm, so I can plot them, I can map them. And here you see maps of every single farm in Switzerland. Every point in these maps is a farm. And colors towards red indicate intensification. It's not that they're intensive in general, because if I would just plot the intensity of farms, then I will just plot the production conditions, of course. But if I plot the change in intensity, then I can show in which areas we have actual intensification and extensification in regard to the year 2000. That's what you see on these maps. And also, I have points that are highlighted, bright colors. And this means that they have a significant local moran, which means that there is a spatial correlation among these farms. So this can be used to show where there are actual significant clusters, where there is a region who intensifies, or there is a whole region who de-intensified in the last couple of years. And with this method, we have identified 5 clusters of de-intensification and 2 clusters of intensification. And also, when looking at the global moran, which is also an indicator that you can calculate as a global indicator for spatial heterogeneity, and plotted through time, then you also see that the spatial correlation has increased over the last 19 years, steadily increased. And then we looked how agricultural policy changes, like these periods we had in Switzerland where things changed, how this had an impact on this development of increasing heterogeneity. And you see that these policy changes kind of halt the process for a while. So maybe farmers hesitate, they want to see what's happening, but once it's over, they just continue with their strategy, and the heterogeneity, the increase in heterogeneity just increased. So this makes me wonder what other drivers led to either intensification or extensification of grassland use intensity in Switzerland, because obviously it's not just policies that play an important role. Other mechanisms are also important. And when we have clusters, of course, then it's obvious that we should look at neighborhood effects. And this is another project that I'm working on that I will not present today because time is just not there. There's not enough time for that. But I use a spatial regression model and farm structural survey data that is spatially explicit, so I can do that. And those preliminary results actually do show that the grassland use intensity of neighboring farms do influence farmers' grassland use intensity decisions. But also I wanted, and this is the second point here, I also wanted to see all these soft factors like farmers' characteristics, attitudes, beliefs, or it can be concluded into a farmer's self-identity. How does a farmer's self-identity influence his or her decision of how intensive they cultivate the grassland? And of course, such information is not part of the farm structural survey. We need a different conceptual framework for that, and we need different data. And lucky me, I was part of these interviews that have been done in the SuperG project, where I can actually gather this data. But let me first just give you an overview on the conceptual framework I was using for this. This is the it's based on the theory of plant behavior, and actually the whole survey, the whole interviews were based on this theory, and it's quite known. It describes decision-making processes through attitudes towards the behavior subjective norm and perceived behavioral control, but it does not show any, the basic theory does not show any leverage points, because attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control are rather seen as tools than actual personal traits. And when you include the concept called self-identity, then the explanatory power of this model is quite improved. So this self-identity, what is it? It's basically what a person would say about itself, about who she or he is. And the important aspects is it's complex and multi-layered, so it can actually be used to explain ambiguous behavior that you sometimes see among farmers. And each individual is able to declare her own self-identity within a survey or interview setting, which we did. And also, which is very important for policy making, an individual self-identity is assumed to be shaped and reshaped through interaction with the social environment. That means at the level of self-identity, we actually have leverage points for policy design. So when we understand farmer self-identity, we have new leverage points for policy design. And when it comes to agriculture, farmer self-identities traditionally have been studied in regard to the transition of agricultural societies from a productivist towards a conservationist society. So the idea is that there is a productivist identity and there is a conservationist identity. And in between, there's something they sometimes call multifunctionalist identity. And productivist, of course, means that you want to produce without caring much about other ecosystem services. So production always comes first if you have a productivist identity, and the conservationist agricultural society mostly cares about other ecosystem services. So a conservationist identity would care about other ecosystem services, and production would come second. And then there are lots of other self-identities that have been described for farmers, but for this study, we hypothesized that farmers identify themselves along two identity gradients, which is the gradient I just described, conservationist, productivist. But another gradient that is often described is this traditionalist, innovationist. So a traditionalist sticks to practices known for decades, believes that's how fathers have been farming, that's the best way. And an innovationist would always look what's new and how he or she can improve farming practices. Now about the interviews. 2 weeks ago in this seminar, someone else was also presenting about the interviews. So interviews have been done with 75 farms in 5 different countries, and these 75 farms were always 25 organic farms, 25 intensive, and 25 extensive farms. And among other questions, there were open and closed questions on farmer self-identity. And today I want to present something about the open questions on farmer self-identity, which you see below. I asked the farmers, what does it mean to be a farmer nowadays? What makes for a good farmer? What do you think other farmers would consider a good farmer? What barriers do you think there are to farmers being a good farmer? And what is the best moment in your life as a farmer? And if anyone listening to this presentation was also involved in the interviews and is confused now, for Switzerland, I did add the 1st and the 5th question to have an even more insight in farmer self-identities. And the other 3 questions were the same for all the other countries. And then, of course, for open questions, we get open answers that we have to code. And this is an answer of an organic farm. And here you see how I coded the answers for the question, what does it mean to be a farmer nowadays? He answered that he wants to preserve biodiversity, which I coded as being a conservationist, but he also wants to feed people, and that's actually important for him, which also indicates a bit productivist identity. As I said, this is multidimensional, so they can reveal different aspects of their identity. He believes that a farmer has to be open to new things and so on. And I have another example here of a intensive farmer who also states that, you know, being trained, having a trained eye, see what's coming, and being independent. He's very innovative, but also he believes that you need to have a better return on products and you need to have less direct payments, because that's not good for farming. You just need better prices for your products, which is very much productivist identity here. And then, having coded all the 75 interviews, I can map the answers now. So I have these 2 assumed gradients of self-identity. Then I use, for each farmer, I use the number of statements towards each identity and divide them through the total number of statements. So someone being right here at the productivist side only talked about being a productivist all the time. Someone up here only talked about being an innovationist. And I can show you now preliminary results that I have received after a first round of coding. And it looks like this. So what you see here is green squares for organic farming, and then we have the blue triangles for intensive farms and brown circles for extensive farms. And the first result is that the majority of farms are located in the conservationist, innovationist quadrant up here. So that's the first insight. And also, when you look at the organic farmers, so most organic farmers are here in this conservationist, innovationist part. When you look at the, yes, how much more?
2 minutes, please.
2 minutes, okay. We'll speed up. So intensive forms can be also found here on the productivist side, not on the far end of the conservationist here. And then the extensive forms, they're like everywhere, but they do not see themselves as pure productivist or innovationist. So they're lacking up here. And then what I can also do, which is like the main result that I wanted to show you, I can connect this data with the farm structural survey. So I can actually look how each farmer behaved in the last 20 years. Did they actually extensify or intensify their production? And then I point the colors similar to how I colored the maps before. So red indicates intensification, green indicates extensification of production. And then the result looks like this. So what we see is most green points are here in the conservationist, innovationist quadrant, and many of them are actually circles, so extensive farmers. And then we also see that many organic farms here are squares. They actually intensified their production, even though they declare a conservationist identity. And like the main conclusion here is that just having a conservationist identity doesn't mean that they actually extensified their production in the last 20 years, but it's in addition, you need to have this innovationist action. So it is innovative action that led to an actual extensification. So most of farmers do declare that they care about nature, but this is not connected with an actual action. Those that also have this innovationist identity, those are the ones that actually extensified their production. And that brings me to the conclusion, which is just a summary of what I just said. So I don't think that I will have to go through this again, or I just leave the slide open, and this will be the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. And yeah, looking forward to your questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Martina. And thank you for keeping the time as well. And the presentation was really interesting. So I know that there are some questions here, but we'll keep it to the end. And now we are going to pass the word to Eva Lieberherr. She's the head of the research group of Natural Resource Policy at the Institute of Environmental Decisions, Department of the Environmental System Sciences at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, ETH, and she has held research and teaching positions at the University of Bern and at the Swiss Federal Institute for Aquatic Science and Research, also in the Oregon State University and in the University of California at Berkeley. Her research is applied and problem-driven, addressing socio-ecological challenges such as the use and protection of natural resources, water, forest, and landscapes. She analyzes natural resources from the angle of the public policy and public administration, and she loves studying the legitimacy, efficiency, and effectiveness of public and private policies and management. So, Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And I'm very happy to present the outcome of a very long process and on behalf of many co-authors. And actually, this is a report that we wrote in link to task 4.1c titled Review of Existing Policies and Impacts. And it was actually led by Eric Hunter from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. So I'm very happy to present this on behalf of Eric and on behalf of many other co-authors, as you see here. So this is a picture of a permanent grassland that I took this spring in the valleys in Switzerland, and it's actually a part of a protected area and technically forest. But there are many management options being put in place to keep this an open landscape. And this is actually what we're interested in looking at in this report, is to look at the different public policies that influence the permanent grassland management. And it's not the permanent grasslands that are being directly managed by the policies, but it's actually the diverse actors who are being regulated by the policies, who then have an effect on the landscape. And on the one hand, it's about the structural components, so the composition of having an open landscape in and of itself, but it's also about the different ecosystems services that generate value and in turn impact the human uses and the humans themselves who then are shaping the policies. So this is kind of the underlying framework of a policy analysis that we did. So the goals of this project were to look at the most relevant policies across 5 European biogeographic regions that impact permanent grassland management. And then in doing so, to analyze the policy logic. So what is the rationale? What are the objectives? And what instruments are then used to achieve those? And what behavioral changes are sought? So what actors are targeted? And what do we in the end achieve? And that's where we come to effectiveness. So here we see an overview of the 5 regions that were covered in this policy analysis. So Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, the Czech Republic, and the UK. So in the first step, we wanted to identify the policies. And we took a 2-step process. First, we asked experts what they consider to be the most relevant policies and related to PG management. So I asked a lot of you in the Super G consortium what you consider to be the most relevant policies. And then we also created blue ribbon panels across the national level. So in each country, part of the study, we had different experts on the panel who gave in their input, what they considered to be the most relevant policies. As we found some disagreement among the experts, what they considered to be the most relevant policies, we then also reviewed the literature. So we came up with 9 EU policies and 15 regional policies that we then analyzed. So here you see the whole list of the policies. So we looked at, obviously, the existing policies. So the CAP was a central policy, but then you see also different sectoral policies, climate change, planning, renewable energy, etc. And we only considered policies adopted by a governmental body, so really public policies. Then we wanted to do the policy mapping. And for this, we created a policy analysis table, which we used for coding the policy documents. And we had different categories in this table, which are as follows. We wanted to map the objectives and the scopes of each policy, the different instruments that were then used to achieve those objectives. And here we differentiated in terms of carrots, sticks, and sermons, so looking at incentives, such as financial subsidies, or the sticks in terms of regulations, and the sermons in terms of informational tools. And then we also looked at the policy targets, so the people who are, you want to change their behavior. So we looked at who was targeted by the policies, plus the delivery channels. And these we understood as either targeting land management in terms of the structure and composition of land, or increasing demand for ecosystem services, or increasing the value for ecosystem services. And then we also looked at the monitoring of each policy and the evaluations being conducted. So we looked at the existing literature out there, so secondary data to do the policy analysis. So for each of these categories, we had subcategories and a total of 50 codes that we used to code the different documents across the 5 countries. So what did we find? We didn't find a uniform objectives that we could quantify, but some of the major aims were to guarantee income to farmers, to support sectors and regions, particularly in rural areas, to compensate the costs of environmental services, and to improve ecosystem services. For the policy instruments, we did quantify across the different types, and we found that the majority of instruments are, on the one hand, incentives, so mainly subsidies, and on the are direct payments, and also regulations. Far fewer we found informational tools. Then for the policy targets, we found the majority of actors being targeted are the farmers, and then also other landscape managers, and also again here very few actually ecosystem service consumers. Then in terms of the delivery channels that were being pursued by the different policy instruments, we found that the majority were landscape structure and then also demand for services, 30%, and very, very few in terms of direct payments for values. So really in terms of cultural or recreational values being steered. Then in terms of the monitoring and evaluation, we didn't conduct an overarching or comparative evaluation of all across the different policies, but we did found indications that there's some lacking of uptake of the different schemes in relation to challenges with monitoring and not necessarily achieving all the goals as intended. So from this, we deduced a policy logic, and we found that primarily it's the regulations and incentives used to influence farmers to adopt desired landscape structure and composition. So really a focus on the structure and composition of the land. This, of course, directly influences, but does not guarantee the range of ecosystem services that are possible from the landscape. And then there was a lack of policies really targeting consumer demand for ecosystem services being produced from permanent grasslands, and very few designed to drive sustainable permanent grassland management by directly promoting value. So we see kind of a potential gap between some of the aims, which the aims were certainly also to promote ecosystem services, where really the emphasis of the policies seemed to be predominantly on structure and composition of the landscape. Then we wanted to know how effective these policies are. And one way to study effectiveness is to look at the degree to which these are being achieved. So in terms of output, outcome, and impact. We didn't do this across the regions. We took more of a bottom-up approach because what constitutes a policy objective differs. We had different policy goals. And we also see different goal orientations across different actors. So we actually wanted to do this via interviews and to take multiple criteria in analyzing effectiveness. So we were interested in relevance, and that this we defined in terms of the coherence between the problem and the policy objectives, the efficiency in terms of cost benefit, democracy in terms of whether the policy is meeting the needs of stakeholders, which also has to do in terms of to what extent the stakeholders are included in developing the policy, and then also legitimacy, which has to do with acceptance and support from stakeholders for the policy. So this can be done either top-down by analyzing the policy instruments and the targets, or bottom-up through stakeholder interviews. And we really focused here on stakeholder interviews. So we conducted 10 interviews in each country, so 50 interviews with different actors, with different types of stakeholders, from government, from academia, from different interests, including environmental and climate interests, and also, of course, the farmers. So what did we find? And here I'm just showing you the aggregated results for the different criteria of relevance, democracy, legitimacy, and efficiency that we ask each of the actors. So here you see that Sweden actually is the most positive attitudes of the stakeholders towards effectiveness, and the UK the least positive. And one way we could explain this was the high level of trust in Sweden, trust in government and in farmer interest organizations, where we actually had a difficult time to find other interest groups beyond these two actor groups. And this is very different, where in Switzerland, for instance, we had very strong also environmental interests who we interviewed. And we also see, for instance, a large divergence in terms of legitimacy, with high legitimacy, for instance, in the Czech Republic, and a rather lower legitimacy in the UK. Then we also find a variance when we look at the attitudes toward effectiveness by actor types. And here we find the governmental actors to be the most positive in general, and the special interest actors to be the most critical. And this is not surprising because the special interest groups were often environmental interest groups who didn't feel like their interests were being adequately represented. What was more surprising was that academia was more positive in their attitudes than the farmers. So some explanations for this. So for the views on effectiveness, particularly from special interest group, We found them to be dissatisfied due to the complexity and multiplicity of the policies. And this was something that came up over and over again in the policy review, was this highly complex policies, or so many policies, and very general also in nature, which came up also in this quote from the report that we wrote, that the first pillar of the CAP, which was considered by all to be the most central and influencing permanent grassland management, wasn't regarded to be so effective because of its very general nature, and the lots of transaction costs also arose in terms of applying it to different regional contexts. So overall, from the stakeholder views, we find challenges regarding environmental objectives, where across the different countries we found pollution, decrease in biodiversity, so the environmental goals not being met. So for instance, a gradual reduction of biodiversity and the ecosystem services it provides despite payments to actually foster or promote this. And then something that came up again and again was the administrative burden of the policies, with excessive administrative bureaucracy due to application for permits, carrying out controls, complexity of applying for aid. And finally, also again, this need to promote goods and services originating from permanent grasslands, which this correlates very nicely to our policy analysis in the first step, which shows that there's really a lack of policies really pushing for ecosystem services. So to conclude, I would like to leave you with 3 points. First, permanent grassland policies that we looked at in this context across 5 European biogeographic regions, highly complex and very general in nature. And this leads to a lot of administrative burden. And so one policy recommendation would be to reduce that administrative burden and make it more easily accessible. Second, moving away from a policy logic that targets farmers with regulation and or subsidies to manage the landscape, so the structure and composition of the landscape, and towards targeting consumer demand for and also the values of ecosystem services. So kind of driving it or trying to affect behavior from a different angle. And in line with this, explicitly targeting the interaction between landscape structures and ecosystem services, because what we also found was that some policies targeted only landscape structures, so the composition of the landscape, or only ecosystem services. But there's actually a lot that could be gained, we believe, if there was more policies fostering the interaction between the two, in order to have, in the end, policy measures that promote permanent grassland management, sustainable permanent grassland management for ecosystem service delivery in Europe. And proponents will say that the New Deal seals, or partially sealed, on Friday, as was already introduced by Alan Matthews. Is it going in this direction? Is it less bureaucratic, as they claim? Is it greener? The Greens argue against that. But again, as Alan said, this very much depends on the national plans that needs to be drafted now and in the implementation of the policies. So if you'd like to read more, there's a 360-page report that you can access here. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Eva. It was an amazing work done and an amazing presentation as well. So we had different questions during this session, and Martina and Alan were replying to some of these. We will now have a poll for the participants to give us your opinion. Francisca will share the poll with you. And please reply to this so that we can see your opinion and the replies that we can get from this. So which of the following policies would you prioritize? To provide financial support for farmers to use their marginal PG for planting trees, to provide financial support for farmers to use their marginal PG for rewilding, provide support for farmers to increase their productivity so that more land can be spared for rewilding, and to only provide support for extensive production to deliver public goods or ecosystem services, or none of the above. So please reply so that we can see what answers can we have to this? And we'll have the Q&A session afterwards. So we had some replies already. I don't know which is the percentage that already replied.
We already had 47% of participants replying. Let's just wait a few more seconds to see if all of them that want to reply have that time.
Okay, so if you want to keep replying on that, maybe we can show the results that we have so far. So the majority of the people who will think or thinks that it only provides support for extensive production to deliver public goods or ecosystem services. So this is the prioritization of the policies. So thank you so much. And picking on this, maybe we can now have all the speakers here. Francisco will put the videos on, and we had some questions during the session that Alan replied, and Martina as well. But maybe at least one of each, maybe we can answer now, because I don't know if everyone saw the reply on the Q&A. Maybe Alan, we can start with you. So this was a question made by Neil Picard. In order to help capture more carbon under permanent grasslands, it will be allowed to sow herbal layers and introduce new seeds through non-plugging techniques, example, direct drilling, to help stimulate grass production in order to capture more carbon dioxide, or are such improvements being discouraged? So if you want to explain a bit better.
It was a rather speculative answer, I'm afraid, because we are waiting, as I say, for this guidance from the Commission later this year, where it will come forward with a communication to give more flesh, if you like, to this idea that it has put forward for carbon farming. It's interesting, just as a complete aside, that the US Senate, in a remarkable bipartisan vote, has just approved funding for a carbon farming initiative in the US. So it would still have to go through the House, but it was something like 95 to 5 votes. So it was very strongly supported, and indeed also by a lot of the US farm organizations. So I think it's a very interesting area. I mean, there are lots of questions, technical issues about how do we measure and monitor, how do we ensure permanence of any carbon that is stored in this way. For a lot of soils, of course, they are net emitters, particularly the organic soils. So converting them into sinks, or even just preventing further emission, is going to be an important objective. So, Neil, I just felt that I wasn't able to give a very specific answer, but simply to say that I think this is really going to be an area which will develop a lot over the next 6 to 12 months. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And Martina, I will pick on Piotr Stipinski's question, because he's speaking about something that we usually face some difficulties in this type of projects. That is that farmers sometimes are not so happy to take part in the different surveys. And he asks, how was it possible for you to get so good responses in your studies? But I think that was not exactly the reality that you faced, right?
Actually, no, and I mean, this is the first interviews I've done, so I haven't done that. I haven't made that experience, but maybe some aspects helped. So before we contacted them by a letter, asking them if they are willing to join to participate in the interviews, and then they sent back a little survey where they indicated how much area they have, and so I could choose from a big pool of, I think, 250 farms that have sent me back, yes, they want to participate in interviews, and they were already motivated. So among them, I could choose the farms that I contacted, and I contacted them, and then I explained them how it will work, and I made an appointment with them. So when I called them, they knew that we will be talking for 1.5 hours. Maybe that was also, they were prepared. They knew that they will be talking, and then I will record them, and it's important that they talk a lot. But then before the questions about the self-identity, there was a part where I just asked them, what kind of farm do you have? What do you do? And they started talking, and I showed a lot of interest, no matter what they told me, no matter whether I found it strange what they did, I just showed interest. And they kept talking and talking. And once we reached these questions that were very important for me, they were so motivated and open. That was my impression, and maybe showing that much interest helped to make them talk a lot.
Okay, thank you so much. We will keep your approach as a good one. So maybe we can use it in this project as well for other type of surveys, because sometimes we face that difficulties, and CONSULAI leading the communication and dissemination work package, sometimes we have that as well. So there is a question here for Alan, but I would make it also for Eva, because this is something that I think it's important to, well, it's a bit more broad. So for Alan, what is your opinion? In your opinion, what is the most important CAP instrument to preserve species, rich species, grasslands, or grasslands with rich species? And also for Eva, I would like to know your opinion. Do you think that the new CAP will have an important influence in the regional policies, at least in the countries that you analyzed in the study that was made? So maybe starting with Alan and then for Eva.
Well, first of all, I mean, I thought Eva's study really helpful and interesting. So I think probably what Eva will reply is going to be more relevant. I mean, what I took from what she said is that you have both sticks and carrots, and clearly for these environmentally sensitive grasslands, we do have regulation. At least for those farmers who are receiving payments, and they of course are the huge majority of farmers in the union. So if you are receiving payments, and the government has designated these environmentally sensitive permanent grassland areas, then you are prevented from ploughing or converting them. But of course, that's not going to necessarily help to maintain the quality of the ecosystem services that you that you might wish to be protecting. So that brings in the other element that Eva emphasized, which is actually paying farmers and if possible trying to do so on a sort of results-based basis, so that you actually try to create a link between what you're trying to protect in those areas and farmers actually then get a sense of that actually they're producing something of value, and they are rewarded for that. And I think that in terms of, again, Martina's really interesting presentation and the sort of self-identity of farmer, I think that, to the extent that we can actually encourage farmers to think of themselves as, producing these services as a valuable contribution along with food and so on. So, I think my answer then is that we need both. We need regulation, I think, but we also need those financial incentives. And the third point, which Eva highlighted, and I always think it tends to get a little bit overlooked, is the information and the advice and supporting farmers, because it is a transition, and for many farmers who have that sort of traditionalist outlook that Martina emphasized, we are asking them to think differently about the way they manage their land, and we do need to recognize that that requires support and assistance and advice and peer groups helping each other and so on. So I think all three would be my answer. But Eva, over to you.
Well, just to build up on that, I completely agree with, second everything that you just said. But we exactly found that, especially the softer informational tools were lacking. But of course, we looked at the official government policies. So there are labeling programs. They're just not in part of the official governmental programs. But beyond targeting then just farmers and landscape managers, we also were recommending to focus more on the consumers. So pushing from the other side, right? Like putting an emphasis on the consumer side, because we also shape, have a lot of influence there. And there's lots of conflicts also arising between different land use values and interests and what we want to do with the land. So putting more emphasis on the informational side on the one hand, so such as labels, for example, and then also on different actor groups, and not putting everything on the farmers, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. And well, thank you for such amazing presentations and for such an interesting thematics that you bring here. Well, we will close now, but before closing, we would like just to make an announcement. It's a launching, so we will launch the Super G photo book today. This was a work done, also a teamwork, of course. This was a work done for many partners in the consortium, and this started to be the idea of Marija Klopšik and of Esther Lele Kovacs. Marija is from the University of Ljubljana and Esther from the MTA from Hungary. This came from a task that is the task 2.3 on the work package 3 of Super G, so related with the landscape and recreation, so related with the ecosystem services. And we launched the Super G photo competition in 2019. It was on for a year, and in 2020 we had the results. This competition was in 5 different thematics. So it was on wildlife and biodiversity, cultural values, farmlands, outdoor recreation, and risk and threats. And this book is the compilation of this work done. So we have 159 photos from different European grasslands in Europe. And we produced a physical book and also an online version, so you can have it. And this book is dedicated to our great friend Dario Sacco, that passed away in 2020, and it's a memory for him as well. And we're very happy with the work done. So I hope that you liked it as well. It's a photographic look of the different grasslands in Europe, and I think it's a good sum up of this webinar series. So thank you so much for participating. If you have any more questions, please send us. We can forward it to our speakers. And thank you for everyone that attended, especially for our speakers as well. Thank you.